Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, Cabinet Secretary Arthur Sinodinos, US journalist Christine Dolan, who co-founded an international coalition against children in slavery, former editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper Chris Mitchell, Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Minister for Education Tanya Plibersek, and Emeritus Professor of Politics at La Trobe University, Robert Manne. Please welcome our panel. We've got a question from Dylan Summerall.
Thank you. In the 2013 election, we saw the headlines and front pages of newspapers saying that we needed Tony Abbott. In the recent election, we saw newspapers positioning Turnbull as our hero. And in the Gillard years, I remember the articles saying, supporting the Ditch the Witch campaign. Does the panel believe that Australian media is playing too big of a role in our elections?
Chris Mitchell. Start with you, and we'll sort of bring up your book here because there's quite a few incidents in the book where you do play a role.
Sure. Look, I don't think, Dylan, that the Ditch the Witch thing had anything much to do with newspapers. You know, it was largely our 2GB campaign, and I think probably, you know, if he'd had his time again, Abbott would have never appeared in near a sign like that. There's also, I think, questions about, you know, how effective campaigns, you know, by some of the tabloids were. And it seems to me the Melbourne and Adelaide News Limited, you know, tabloids were fairly straight. Brisbane and Sydney were not. I think the Oz was pretty straight in 2013. There was complaints about, you know, how the paper handled the period, the 17-day period during the negotiations with Oakeshott and Windsor. But Julia rang me on the Friday and thanked me for the straight coverage.
It's funny you say Julia rang me because there's a lot of incidents in your book where a Prime Minister or other rings you, and you gave plenty of political advice, for example, to Tony Abbott. You told him to demote Joe Hockey as Treasurer. You told him to reduce his reliance at the very least, if not get rid of Peter Credlin. I mean, is that the role of a newspaper editor, to be advising politically behind the scenes what Prime Ministers should be doing?
I think generally those sort of relationships, and they're not just relationships with me, I think they're across the media. And I think Prime Ministers do ring, you know, they do ring and they do ask the question. Certainly I think, you know, Robert knows that Kevin rang regularly, and I think he rang both Robert and me.
With me for no reason.
I mean,
Well, Chris, can I put it, I mean, you mentioned Kevin Rudd, and of course he rang you before he even became Prime Minister with the request that you put out a news poll.
He did.
Working out whether he and Julia Gillard would do a better job of winning an election against John Howard than Beazley and his team. So, and you did that?
Yeah, well, we talked about the request, and I suppose I was sceptical about the idea of Kevin being able to form a partnership with Julia. Julia had, you know, greater numbers in the caucus, and I thought Kevin probably only had about 20, and I didn't see how that would stick together. But he claimed to be on the Great Wall of China with various grandees who could pull the team together. And I guess I think what I say in the book is probably in hindsight, it would have been better for the Labor Party and the country if Kim Beazley had remained Prime or Leader, had won an election or not won an election, if it had been either Costello or Beazley. And it would have been better for Kevin and for Julia if they'd been front benchers in a Beazley government.
Well, strangely enough, I see Tanya Plibersek nodding as you were saying that.
I always thought that Kim Beazley could have won that election. And
Me too.
I think we would have had a period of stability under Kim. I don't think we would have won by the same margin, but I think we would have won. And I think both Kevin and Julia at that stage had a very legitimate aspiration to be leader sometime in the future. But I think for both of them, a period in a Beazley government would have been a very good thing, and I think it would have been a great thing for the country.
Let's go to the question that was asked, and really it was about whether the media plays too big a role. And I guess what I'm getting at here with Chris is whether editors of major newspapers or media organisations or powerful media players play behind the scenes too big a role.
Look, I think there's no secret that media organisations seek to influence election outcomes. I think you couldn't pretend that News Limited hasn't done that. And certainly, you know, a number of the radio networks are pretty plain in their advocacy for the Conservative parties. I don't know that it has the same effect that it used to have. Like, I really think that once upon a time, talkback radio and tabloid newspapers swung a lot of votes. And I'm not sure, I think, Chris, you might have observed this yourself, that in more recent years, because people are changing the way they consume media, they're buying fewer newspapers, they're getting media from different sources. I just don't see the strength of that influence anymore. We've had newspapers campaigning against us quite vociferously in election campaigns at a state and federal level, and they haven't really.
I'll just quickly throw back a brief answer on this, Chris.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me that it's a new phenomenon. It seems to me that neither Hawke nor Keating nor John Howard were as engaged with these kinds of conversations as the more recent leaders. I think it's partly, 24-hour news, partly Twitter, the whole rise of social media, the preeminence of the daily messaging over the 3-year sort of horizon, and let's do 3 big things by the next election. And I think that's what's different in my 25 years.
I'll just, before I go to that side of the panel, I want to hear from Christine. Now, you're a journalist. In the United States, there are accusations the media plays far too big a role in politics. Most of them are coming at the moment from Donald Trump, who says the media is running a conspiracy against him.
The media in the United States has changed. When I was political director at CNN, I took my job very, very seriously. And the Fourth Estate has gone down the hill. It's not that we have a tension naturally between politicians and the media, and that comes naturally. The problem is this: in the course of the last, I would say, 8 years, that we have government officials threatening journalists. We have journalists not doing their jobs in terms of coverage. I noticed since I've been in the country for the last 2 weeks, every time that there was a WikiLeaks dump about the Clinton Foundation, there was a new Donald Trump chick, okay? And I think that in terms of networks playing bias...
So do you actually think the networks or the Clinton campaign's holding back these women and releasing them one by one? Is that what you suggest?
I'm telling you the timing is something that people should be very concerned about, because Donald Trump has been out there for a long time. Donald Trump... in January, a lot of people said in the States he's not going to get the nomination. What people don't understand is that there's a different culture in the United States. People are mad as hell. That's why Bernie had a lot of crowds. That's why Trump has a lot of crowds. We have a collusion of our government. There is no accountability, no IRS accountability. There's no congressional accountability. There's money in politics that's off the charts. I started covering politics. My first presidential campaign as a journalist was 1980. And today it is an issue. Anybody that says that you should raise $1 billion for a political campaign should be ashamed of themselves, okay? And that's what happened in 2008. We had people in 2008 that wanted anybody but Hillary who are now for Hillary, okay? We do not follow our lead in terms of politics and do not follow our lead in terms of the Fourth Estate, because we are losing morality and courage in terms of covering and holding politicians accountable.
Robert Manne.
Can I just interpret it a bit more narrowly, the question about... I'm actually a bit shocked at the amount, and Chris's book shows this, the amount of time that Prime Ministers, leading politicians, spent with journalists in a sort of semi-private way. My view would be that newspapers, in order to report objectively and fairly, ought to not have private relations with leading politicians at all. I think it makes the relationship very confused, because, one minute you're palling up, drinking together, laughing, telling stories which will later come out in memoirs. And the next minute you're meant to be reporting on them. And I think that it would be much better to have a sterner kind of silo between editors of newspapers in particular and leading politicians. I actually would be surprised to know that Obama spent time laughing and joking with the head of CNN or the
You'd
networks.
be surprised, though, Robert. There were people that were invited into the White House who he met with on a regular basis, okay? So, and also, I always had a rule of thumb that, You know, after 2 drinks, everything's off the record. You're invited into the politician's home. That's completely off the record in what you see and what you report. I believe that you have to have ethics, because if not, then it hurts everybody else in the profession.
Okay, we're going to come back to that question. I want to hear from Arthur Sinodinos. Are you surprised at the closeness? Well, you wouldn't be, because you're an advisor to prime ministers. But the closeness between prime ministers and big media players like Chris?
I think there's always been a closeness with media proprietors, going back particularly to the broadcast era, the Frank Packer era. You can go back a long way. And some prime ministers, Billy McMahon, for example, would have thought he could influence Frank Packer and therefore what the Daily Telegraph ran on their front page and all the rest of it. There's always this illusion that that's the case. But in my experience, newspapers are very careful about that. They're not just going to run something because you want them to run it. They've got to have an eye to their own reputation. There are some editors who want to be players. And I noticed in the last campaign, some editors in some regional seats, for example, pushing very strongly for certain things to happen for that region. Now, they would say, I'm standing up for my region. But what they're doing is they're there as players, and they've got leaders of the opposition and prime ministers turning up. I have to say, as someone who's dealt mainly with the press gallery in Canberra, most of them I actually find pretty good to get on with if everybody knows the ground rules. And the ground rules are you shouldn't lie to them. Once you've lied to them and they found out about it, that's the end of the relationship. The other thing is always assume, even in a friendly encounter, that they are on the job. One of the worst things about being a journalist, it's like a drug. You can never be off it. As a journalist, you're always looking for where the story will come from. So you've always got to assume when you're talking to them the possibility that you're giving them their next story. Some prime ministers thought that they could use the media to promote the policy debate. For example, Keating, when he was Treasurer and Prime Minister, effectively argued that the press gallery should be a cheer squad for economic reform. And he'd go out there or upstairs in the gallery, he'd show them charts of the J-curve on the balance of payments and explain why it would take time for a depreciation of the currency to show up in the improvement in the trade balance, all that sort of thing. So there's a bit of proselytising going on. And in turn, what I found in the Howard era was John Howard himself would deal with editors, but he very rarely, if ever, picked up the phone to an editor and complained about something. And the reason for that is, guess what? At the end of the day, the journo or the editor has the last say. They say what goes in the paper. There's no point.
Arthur, I'm just going to bring it back quickly to Chris before we move on to other subjects. But I think one of the most astonishing things I thought was Kevin Rudd contacting you and asking what industrial relations reforms your paper would support so that he could go ahead and create an industrial relations regime which you would back.
Yeah, no, I'd never seen anything like it either, and I'd agree with what Arthur said about both John and Paul. You know, I took it at face value. He was coming over to visit me that weekend, and so I called in Paul Kelly and Brad Norrington, and we had a bit of a chinwag about particularly personal contracts, individual contracts, and yeah, that's what I told him on the Sunday.
And did it end up in policy?
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Were you surprised?
I was very surprised that he asked, and it's never happened since, and it had never happened before.
Tanya, was that appropriate? Is that the way the Labor Party conducts its business, generally speaking?
Well,
to basically ask an editor what his industrial relations policy should be, then go ahead and change it.
The way we decide policy is through our national conferences and through our shadow ministers and our shadow cabinet processes. And it's an irregular way of approaching it, and I don't like.
That's a very modest way of putting it, Tony.
But I guess there's two things to say. I think that I think it was Tony Blair that said complaining about the way you get treated by the media is a bit like complaining about the weather. It might make you feel momentarily better, but it doesn't really change anything. So I don't see the point of people ringing newspaper editors or journalists saying, you've treated me really unfairly. I think it's our job to make a case for change. So what are the problems facing us as a nation? What is our idea about the best way of solving them? Building a consensus that this is the best way forward. And if I'm not doing my job of explaining the problems and the potential solutions and the one I've landed on well enough, then that's my fault. It's no one's fault but mine.
All right, we talked about Trump a little earlier. We've got a question along those lines from Stephen Weng. Go ahead.
It is easy to condemn the words and actions of Trump, Farage, or even Pauline Hanson, but much harder to actually confront the democratic processes that put them there without calling their supporters ignorant, racists, or to use the contemporary term, deplorables. How do the major parties seek to engage voters who are clearly alienated by their mainstream representatives?